We continue now at the top of Daf Gimel Amud Aleph in Meseches Eruvin. This is Eruvin Daf 73a. The Gemara had just said that there's a machlokas amoraim. What is considered makom dira? What's considered the place where a person lives in regards to the halachas of Eruvin? So Rav says makom pita. As we mentioned earlier, Rav says it follows the place where a person's bread is, with the place where the person eats. Well, Shmuel Amar makom lina, and Shmuel says no, it's the place where the person sleeps. So Mesa, we have a question from the following brisa. Haroim, let's say you have shepherds, v'hakaitzin, v'haborganin, v'shomrei peiros. These are different kinds of watchmen of various fruits. Bisman shedarkon lolin ba'ir. If it's normal for them to stay overnight to sleep in the city, harehein ka'an she'ir, then they follow the tchum of the people of the city. Bisman shedarkon lolin basad. If it's normal for them to sleep in the area of the field, yesh lam alpayim l'chol ruach, then they get 2,000 amos in every direction from the place where they're sleeping. So over here, it certainly seems that it goes by the place where we're sleeping. It seems to be a proof for Shmuel. So the Gemara says, no, Hasam over there, Anon Sahadi, we are witnesses. It is clear to us. The Imamtu Lahu Rifta Hasam, if you would bring them bread over there, Tzveinichalu, that would certainly be better for them in that particular situation. Rashi over here says, Bisman Shadargon Lolin Ba'ir B'makom Sha'ochlin. So if they sleep in the city, they happens to be they ate in the city as well. Afal Pi Shakidash Aleim Hayom Besada Yesh Lahem Min Ha'ir Alpayim L'chol Ruach V'chol Ir Lehen Kedal Ramos. Again, they measure from the city. Bisman Shadargon Lolin Besada Afal Pi Sha'ochlin Ba'ir. Again, even though they're eating in the city, but if they sleep in the field, Ein Moded in Lohen Elam Min Asada, we measure from the field. Seems like we go by where they sleep. And the Gemara explains, and Rashi says, the Imam Tulu Riftol Ahasam Tveinichalu. In that particular case, they would much prefer to eat in the field. That's not even a question. They have no choice, so they have to go to the city to eat. They have to be on guard. They have to watch the area. They're going to sleep there, so of course they want to eat there. The only thing is they can't eat there, so that's why in this particular situation, it follows the area where they sleep. But in general, it could be we follow the place where a person eats. Amar Rav Yosef says, Lo shmiya li hashmaita. I've never heard this particular sugya. Rashi over here says, Lo shmiya li hashmaita damar Rav. I never heard the statement of Rav, makom pita gorim, that it follows the place of the bread. Rav Yosef was sick, v'shokach talmudo, he forgot his learning. V'haya Abaya talmido maskiro, and Abaya, who was a student, used to remind him. So Rav Yosef said, I don't remember this teaching of Rav. Amar le Abaya, so Abaya said to him, Ata amr nehilan ve'ha amr nehilan. You said it to us, and you said it to us on the following statement. It says, let's say you have brothers and they sit by their father's table, and they sleep in their own houses. This was the Mishnah. It says, so they need to each make an Eruv. It's considered independent, even though they eat by the table of their father, it goes by where they sleep. And so we said to you when we heard this Mishnah, does that show that it goes by the place where a person sleeps? And you responded to us on this particular Mishnah, that Rav Yehuda says in the name of Rav, that this is not talking about that they really eat by their father. If they really ate by their father, it's possible it would follow where they eat. The situation over here is where they receive a portion of food from their father, but they eat it in their own location. Gemara now continues with a brisa. Tanur Rabbanan, we learned in a brisa, Misha yeshlo chamesh noshim mikablos pras mi ba'alein. Let's say there are 5 wives, and again they get portions of food from their husband. Or v'chamisha avodim. Let's say you have 5 servants, mikavlin pras mi rabbein, and they get portions of food from their master. Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira matir benoshim v'oser ba'avodim. So Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira says that when it comes to the women, we allow. In other words, we don't consider it to be separate residence. But when it comes to the avodim, we're going to aser. Rashi over here explains, oser ba'avodim she'einon nimshachan acharav. The servants, they're not nimshach after him. They don't follow automatically the master just because they're getting a portion of food from the master. Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava matir ba'avodim ve'oser benashim. Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava says the exact opposite. The avodim are drawn after the master, so they don't prohibit. They're not like their own residence. Whereas the wives, they actually are going to be a problematic situation. They're going to be considered an independent residence that needs an Eruv. Amar Rav, now Rav says on this machlokas over here, my time with Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava. What is the reason of Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava specifically with regards to avodim? What is the source that avodim are drawn after their master? Dechsiv, because it says, V'Daniel b'sra malka. It says that Daniel was at the gate of the king. And Rashi here explains, b'sra malka, b'chol mokom, shu chashiv le b'sra malka. Wherever he was considered by the king. That's what we're darshaning from the pasuk. Gemara now says, Pshit, it's obvious. Ben eitz alaviv kid amr. We've already discussed what is the status of a son by a father, whether he follows or not. That was the discussion in the Mishnah. Isha eitz al balo, v'yeved eitz al rabo. What about when you have a situation of, again, a wife by a husband, a servant by a master? Do they follow or do they not follow in terms of the Hilchas Eruvin? Pluksa de Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira, for Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava. That also we've already addressed. That was a machlokas between Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira and Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava, which we just had. But what about the following case? Talmud Eitzel Rabo Mai. What about a student who eats by his Rebbe? What's the halach in that case? So Tashma will bring a raya. The Rav be Rabbi Chia Omar, because Rav lived or had, again ate by the house of Rabbi Chia, and he said as follows: Ein anu tzrichin la'arev. He said we don't need to make an erev. Sharei anu samchen al shulchano shel Rabbi Chia, because we rely on the table of Rabbi Chia. So you see indeed that the Talmidim do follow the Rebbe as far as the Hilchos Eruvin. Rabbi Chia be Rebbe Amar, and Rabbi Chia in the house of Rebbe, he said, it's similar to Rav in the house of Rabbi Chia. Rabbi Chia learned in the house or in the yeshiva of Rebbe. So he said, Ein anu tzrichin la'arev. He said the same thing. We don't need to make an erev. Sharei anu samchen al shulchano shel Rebbe, because we rely on the table of Rebbe. Abaye asked Rabba the following question: Chamisha shagavu es Eruvin. Let's say 5 people collected their erev, and they are now united as one. They've made an erev on their own. Now they want to go take their erev to a different place because they want to join a different chutzner. So erev echad l'kulan or tzrichin erev l'chol echad v'echad. Is it one erev for all of them, or do we need an independent erev in each and every for each and every situation? Now, this, of course, was explicitly discussed in the previous Amud. So Rashi here points out, Abaye did not hear. That's why Abaye was asking this question. He didn't hear the brisa that we had on Daf Ayin Beis Amud Beis, the previous Amud. Heisha Gavu es Eruvin, about 5 people collect the erev. It's exactly this case. Inami Shmiele, or you could say he did hear it. Maybe he was asking what's the halacha. Mishum du kimnan lab bepluksa, because ultimately that was a machlokas. So he wants to know what the halacha is. But in any case, that's Abaye's question from Rabbah. What's the halacha in this case? Amar le, so he responded, erev echad l'kulan. One erev for all of them. They're all considered one. Gemara says, "V'achin dechi gavu damu v'katanu tzrichin erev l'chol echad v'echad." So I said, what are you talking about? By the case of all the brothers who they're eating by the father, that's the same as if they collected together. And yet in that particular case, the Mishnah said you need an erev for each and every one. So the Gemara explains, no, remember, in the Mishnah, the case is it's not only the father and the brothers. There are other residents who are living in that chutzner. Demigo dehani asri, because since those residents force you to make an erev and they aser, hani nami asri. So the brothers also become considered independent in this case, and they also aser, and they need to join the erev. And the Gemara says, hachinam mistabra. Makes sense, because that's what the Mishnah actually says. The Katani, because the Mishnah went on to say, Amosai, when is this true? Bisman shemolichin es Eruvin b'makom acher, when they bring the erev to another place. Avalim haya Eruvan ba etzlam, but if the erev comes to them, o she'ein diur nimoin b'chatzir, or no one else lives in the chatzir with them, implying that if someone else lives in the chatzir, that's what creates the problems. Ein tzrichin la'arev, then they don't need to make the erev shma mina. You see from this. So basically, here is where the Gemara is explaining our Mishnah. That in the Mishnah, it's not simply that the brothers are considered a separate residence and they create problems. That's only true with this migo. If you have other residents in the chatzir who are creating problems, who are answering, so then the brothers as well are going to have an issue, and they're going to have to make an independent, and they're going to have to independently join the erev. Rashi over here says, "Well, achin demasnisin kagavu as Eruvin dami." In our Mishnah, isn't it the same thing? It's as if they all collected the erev together with their father. Takatani and imeni moin ziyur nein tzrichin la'arev, because that's what it says. It says over there that if no one else lived there, they don't need to make an erev. Apparently, they're united as one with the father. So the Gemara answered, no, it's different if there are people living there. In that particular case, if there are other people living there, then they do have to make an eruv. Since already the other residents are creating the need for an eruv, so the brothers also will aser. But for example, let's say you have 2 chatzeros, so Pesach beineim, and there's a door between them. And then one group collects an eruv and unites. And their chatzer's mutter, and the other ones do the same thing. Or similarly, you'd have a father and his sons with no one else living there. They want to make an eruv together. Since in this case you don't have this migo of anyone else answering, you can have one be a shlich for everyone. You see from the Mishnah itself that is in fact the case. And the Gemara continues with a question. Rav Chia Baravin asked from Rav Sheshis the following question. B'nei Bei Rav, if you have the students of Rav, they eat their bread in the field, and they sleep and they reside overnight in the house of Rav. When we measure the tchum, do we measure from the house of Rav, or do we measure from the field where they eat? So he said to Rav, we measure from the house of Rav where they're sleeping. So he asked a simple question, what about the case where a person places his Eruv within 2,000 amos of his house? He obviously wants to make an Eruv Tchum, the classic case of Eruv Tchum. But then he goes and he sleeps overnight in his house. Where do we measure the Tchum from? We measure it from the Eruv. That's what an Eruv Tchumen is. So why over there are we measuring from the food, and over here we're saying that when they sleep at the Beirav, we measure from the Beirav? So he answered, in both cases, we have an anon sahadi. In other words, we are witnesses. We know where the person really wants to make their real residence. For example, in the case where a person makes an Erev Tchum, of course he would prefer to reside where the food is, where the Erev Tchum is. The whole point is he's walking in that direction. That would be closer to where he needs to go. He just doesn't have a place to sleep there. And over here in the case of Rav as well, we have an anon sahadi. We are witnesses as to what the desires of the students are. Because if we would bring bread to the house of Rav, of course they would like that more, and they'd be able to eat in the area where they're sleeping, in the area where they're learning. So boy, Rami Bar Chama Rav Chisda. Now Rami Bar Chama asked Rav Chisda the following question. Avu beno harav v'talmido karabim damu o kiyachidim damu. When it comes to a father and his son, a rebbe and his student, are they considered like a rabbim, like multiple residents, or is it considered like a single residence? It's like one house owned by one person. What does that have a status of? What is the nafka mina? For a few things. Number one, srichan erev or ain't srichan erev. Do they need to make an erev, or they don't need to make an erev? If they're one, they don't need to make an erev. It's just like if you have your own independent house, you don't make an erev. It's only when you're sharing when there's a rabbin. Another question: mavui shalahen niter balachi v'kora. Let's say you have a mavui that includes this situation: a father and children, a rav and talmidim. Is that going to be mattered with a lechi and a kora? Oh, ain't niter balachi v'kora, or a lechi and kora is not going to work. Rashi will explain that as well. So Rashi says, "Ha'avu beno harav talmido karabim damu linyan shtei chatzeros zulif nimizu." The case is you have two chatzeros, one inside the other. Udrisas regal hapnimis ala chitzona. The people in the inner chatzer, they have to walk through the outer chatzer in order to get to the rishus harabim. Utanan b'masnisan, and we learned in our Mishnah im hayu shal yechidim, if it belonged to an individual, meaning sheyachid dar b'pnimis. Let's say just one person lives in the inner chatzer to have a regal hamuteres b'makoma. So there it has the status of the inner chatzer is mutter in its own right. The inner chatzer doesn't need an erev because it's just one private property. Eino seres shelo b'makoma. So he said that if it's muteres b'makoma, it doesn't answer the outer chatzer shelo b'makoma. Because since the guy on the inside can carry around in his chutzner, so the fact that he walks to the outer chutzner doesn't bother them. V'im shal rabim, but let's say the inner chutzner belongs to many people. V'lo irva, and they didn't make an erev. Pnimis liatzma dehavi regel ha'asur b'makoma. Now the inner one itself is a problem to carry in. That's called the regel ha'asur b'makoma. Oseres al chitzona. Then that's going to answer the outer chutzner. Afilu irva chitzona liatzma. Even if the outer one made an erev, but the people they didn't join the erev with the people on the inside, it's going to be a problem. So that's one situation where it makes a difference if they're yechidim or rabbim. Another place where it makes a difference is the following: tzrichin erev. Do they need an erev? B'she'ein diyur nacherim iman. Let's say no one else lives with them. Do they need to make an erev? That's a case we've already addressed a few times. And finally, niter b'lechi v'kora. Dekaimal an ein mavvei niter b'lechi v'kora ad sheyehu botim v'chatzeros psuchim l'socho. The halacha is a mavvei. You can't use a lechi and a kora and a mavvei, which is classically what you do, unless you have plural houses and plural chatzeros opening into it. Now, if these people are considered like private property, it's not considered like a rabbim. Would we consider this two chatzeros? One of the father, one of the son. These two chatzeros, would we now consider them like one chatzer? And if they're like one chatzer, you don't have plural chatzeros, and you're not going to be able to use a lechi or korah with the mavui. So that's the question in terms of, so really Rashi says there are three issues. Three separate issues in terms of whether they're considered yechidim or rabbim. There's whether they need to make an erev, whether the mavui is nitar b'lechi v'korah, and Rashi added this one. Let's say you have one chatzer inside the other. Is it going to aser that outer chatzer? So Amar Lei, so he responded to him, Tani Sua, we learned it in a brisa, Avu b'no, harav talmida, when it comes to a father and son, a rebbe and a Talmud, bisman sheini moin et yurin, if there's no one else living with them, harein ki yechidim, they are considered yechidim, v'yein tzrichin la'arab, and they don't need to make an erev. So in terms of those two halachas, they're considered yechidim. The inner chutzner would not ask for the outer chutzner. They don't need to make an erev with each other. However, umavui shalahen niter b'lechi v'korah. when it comes to their mavoi, they are considered in that case like rabim, so they're not considered like one chatzar. It could be considered like two chatzeros, and you could be matter it with a lechi and a korah. And now the Gemara continues with the Mishnah, chamesh chatzeros psuchos ulazu psuchos lamavoi. Let's say you have 5 chatzeros, they open into each other, and they open into the mavoi as well. Irvu bechatzeros v'lo nishtatzvu b'mavoi. Let's say the chatzeros all make eruvs with each other because they're connected to each other and they don't even need to walk through the mavoi. So mutarn bechatzeros v'asurin b'mavoi. The chatzeros are fine, but you can't carry in the mavoi. Rashi says over here, Irvu bechatzeros af mizulazu. They made an eruv in the chatzeros one to the other, meaning not only each chatzer independently, they also connected each other. The asurin b'mavoi, but the mavoi is no good. Rashi says, Dein somchen al eruv b'makam shituf, because this mission is saying we don't rely on eruv chatzeros instead of shituf. You need to do a shitufim avos as well if you want to carry in the mavoi, and we'll continue with this mishnah in the next video on Daf Ayin Gimel Amud Beis.